So today we're starting to really think about the context for strategy development, which we call situation analysis. This Adaptive Management for Conservation training program is supported by UNDP with GEF financing. It's delivered by Conservation Management and Community Solutions in partnerships with the Blue Mountains World Heritage Institute. The source material is used under a Creative Commons licensing based on original materials developed by the Conservation Measures Partnership and Protected Area Solutions. So where are we up to? We're still assessing our plan and thinking about what's happening around us, so thinking about that situation. But we are on the last step of the assess process. So why do we do this step? We're really thinking about the links between targets, threats, and the causes of those threats. And this really helps our strategies get more focused. Using a diagram can really help explain to people how we see things are working and can help form the start of later work when we're actually coming up with a theory of change or results chains. It also enables us not just to think about some of the problems, but also to add on some of the opportunities. It can be really easy to overcomplicate this step, so we really encourage you to keep it as simple as possible. So, situation analysis. We'll come back to this. It's really an assessment of the relationships between the targets and the human factors that guide our actions. So we usually ask 3 basic questions for every threat. What is causing this thing to happen? Who is involved directly or indirectly? And why are they doing it? You're really analysing the situation, so you're trying to answer those 3 questions so that you develop strategies that are really going to make a difference. So the other way we look at this is we ask, but why? There's a lot of whys in this step. You're really trying to get to the bottom of who and what are causing the problems. So the other thing, we've talked about developing more robust strategies, but the other thing that's important here is it can really help you identify stakeholders that may not have come up when you did your first stakeholder assessment. It can help you identify stakeholders who may be part of the causing the problem, but it can also help you think about their motivations. It can also help you identify stakeholders who could be part of the solution. We touched on the fact that this can easily get overcomplicated, so we really get people to focus on critical threats or targets which have very poor health or poor viability. We touched on the fact that you're not just thinking in this sort of step about the problems and the causes of the problems, you're also thinking about opportunities. What's changing for the better? What will improve our lives and the environment? So you don't need to focus just on the problems. We also suggest you don't focus too much on what dollars would be needed at this stage. It's about what people can do within their communities. So, for example, there might be increased interest in ecotourism and cultural tourism, which would help look after some of the socio-cultural targets. Might mean there's a market for traditional crafts, so that helps support traditional culture and livelihood. There might be an opportunity to get a university project to study turtles, which will give protection and income. So, as well as thinking about what why, and the problems, this is a really great part of the process to think about what are the opportunities, what are the key things that you might be able to build on and get working for you. So when we're doing this, there's not really one right way to do this. Some teams use box and arrow diagrams, others use probing questions. The diagramming is really just a way of capturing it. So in this course, we're going to give you a chance at practicing using those box and arrow diagrams. And here, so if we've got our target, which might be a woodland, and we've got a threat to that woodland, which is wildfire, we start thinking about what is causing this threat. So it might be tourists or campers. So why is that happening? There might be a lack of visitor management, a lack of site management. Who else is involved or who might care about this? Might be the tourism association. You can sort of start to think about not just trying to address the specific threat or the direct threat, which is fire, but what are the things causing it, and who are the people involved. So there's different places where you could potentially think about intervening here. So you might be able to work through the tourism association. You could work directly with the tourists and campers. You might work with the agency who's managing the site. So it just helps you think about what's going on. When we look at the Lake Tubu case study, we've got here a target, which is culture and tradition. And the biggest threat that was identified for this was noise pollution, which was caused by flight paths. The reason there was a problem with the flight paths is there'd been a lack of consultation and people felt there was a lack of respect for traditional customs. So one of the strategies identified was to work with mining companies to reduce this noise pollution problem. If we look at our second target from Lake Tubu, the endemic fish, there were two high-level threats identified here. So one was tilapia, the other was unsustainable fishing. When people started thinking about what was causing this, the demand for food was driving both the introduction of tilapia farms and also the unsustainable fishing, and that was being driven by an increasing population, at least partly driven by people being attracted by mining jobs. Thinking about the unsustainable fishing, it was also felt that fishing zones were no longer being enforced, and that was at least partly because there was a lack of respect for some of the traditional customs. So this team were able to identify a number of strategies, and on the diagram here we can see how those strategies actually interact with this situation. So you can actually remove invasive species from the waterway, so you actually remove the tilapia directly, but that doesn't necessarily address the demand for food and some of the other issues. If you want to address things around the increasing population and the fact that they're putting pressure on the local environment, what you might need to do is to be working with the mining company to look for ways to reduce impacts. Similarly, if you're working with the mining company to reduce impacts, you're not necessarily dealing with things like the enforcement of customary fishing zones. So you might want to have a strategy which is around getting some enforcement of those customary rules. So situation analysis, it's really looking kind of who are the key stakeholders with a vested interest in this project? What's driving the critical threats and what opportunities exist? We've shown you some pretty neat looking situation diagrams. We thought we should probably throw one in which shows how they can look in practice. If you look carefully at this, you can see there's very little in the way of writing on this. It's pretty much all symbols or diagrams. So you can really do this at a range of levels and in a range of ways with people depending on what they feel comfortable with. It's a pretty hands-on activity and you're really making a picture of the links between all of these things. You can do it with a whole group if there's not too many targets, but we find it's usually better to break up into smaller groups and then have people come and look around the pictures and maybe add some things or ask questions about the connections as you go. Now, if we're thinking about tips, too much detail can make a conceptual model into what we call a spaghetti mess. So if you've got greater than 10 threats, you're definitely going to have greater than 25 factors. Another tip, it's usually an iterative process. So you should really change the model as new or different information comes available. And it's also really useful to get people to have a bit of a look at it and say, oh, hey, have you thought of that? Or hang on, how are these people involved? You can really get some better information. As we touched on, and we'll do this as our practice, it's really best to start with one target and a critical threat to that target at a time. So you're capturing factors that apply to that. You might actually capture some things that actually contribute to more than one threat, but your diagram will be a lot more manageable. Now, when you get to course 2, you're going to do, I think, quite a lot more work on stakeholder analysis. But we often find this situation analysis is really useful for helping you think about your stakeholder list and thinking about how you might work with them. So here we are. We've got, for example, a pastoral company that has some influence, some campers who have some importance. The state government is significant. The tourism body is significant importance and influence. So you can sort of map them out in terms of where you think they sit. Oh, hang on, the Indigenous Protected Area team has no influence and some importance. They're going to find that tricky, but you can sort of add people on as you go through. And then you can start thinking about who are the key people that you really need to speak to, who are going to have a really big influence on what happens here. So when you're doing situation analysis, you want to do some preparation before you get together to do it. So we find involving the right people is the key to it. So you really need people who understand the situation and understand what's driving it. It's very hard to do a situation analysis if most of the people in the group don't have a really good understanding of what's happening locally. We also think you should give this step enough time so that your team can actually understand the key issues. So it might involve more than one round of discussion, so it can be quite useful to build that into your planning. So when you're sort of looking at your initial cut, you also want to think, when you're looking at the situation analysis, does it actually focus on the factors contributing to critical or high-level threats or targets with impaired health? There's not much point putting together a really detailed situation analysis for something that's a low-level threat to something that's in good health. That's just a lot of time and energy you've spent on something which probably isn't a big priority in your plan. You also want to think, have all the relevant types of factors been considered? Have you thought about the economics of the situation, the politics, cultural influences, institutional influences? And then touching back on that top point we made, really go through and think about whether there are things which are not really important or redundant, and can you actually sort of tidy up your diagram by excluding those. So we'll now give you some time to ask Stuart and I some questions, and then we'll move through to talking you through how you're going to do some situation analysis on your case study.